Welcome to my closet. No animals, and I don't think I have anything provocative up there. Unless I'm going to talk about my deodorant, which we should not do. Anyway, let's read about law, chapter farm. So this first excerpt is from the book called Animal Farm. It's kind of a weird story, but it makes sense. Okay. It was just after the sheep had returned on a pleasant evening when the animals had finished work and were making their way back to the farm buildings that the terrified neighing of a horse sounded from the yard. Startled, the animals stopped in their tracks. It was Clover's voice. She neighed again, and all the animals broke into a gallop and rushed into the yard. Then they saw what Clover had seen. It was a pig, walking on his hind legs. Yes, it was Squealer. A little awkwardly, as though not quite used to supporting his considerable bulk in that position. But with perfect balance, he was strolling across the yard. And a moment later, out from the door of the farmhouse came a long file of pigs, all walking on their hind legs. Some did it better than others. One or two were even a trifle unsteady and looked as though they would have liked the support of a stick, but every one of them made his way right around the yard successfully, and finally there was a tremendous baying of dogs and a shrill crowing from the black cockerel, and out came Napoleon himself, majestically upright, casting haughty glances from side to side, and with his dogs gamboling around him. Napoleon was the head pig, by the way. He carried a whip in his trotter. There was a deadly silence. Amazed, terrified, huddling together, the animals watched the long line of pigs march slowly round the yard. It was as though the world had turned upside down. Then there came a moment when the first shock had worn off, and when, in spite of everything, in spite of their terror of the dogs and of the habit developed through long years of never complaining, never criticizing, no matter what happened, they might have uttered some word of protest. But just at that moment, as though at a signal, all the sheep burst out into a tremendous bleating of, "4 legs good, 2 legs better. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. 4 legs good, 2 legs better." It went on for 5 minutes without stopping, and by the time the sheep had quieted down, the chance to utter any protest had passed, for the pigs had marched back into the farmhouse. Benjamin felt a nose nuzzling at his shoulder. He looked round. It was Clover. Her old eyes looked dimmer than ever. Without saying anything, she tugged gently at his mane and led him round to the end of the big barn, where the 7 commandments were written. For a minute or two they stood gazing at the tattered wall with its white lettering. "My sight is failing," she said finally. "Even when I was young, I could not have read what was written there, but it appears to me that that wall looks different. Are the 7 commandments the same as they used to be, Benjamin?" For once Benjamin consented to break his rule, and he read out to her what was written on the wall. There was nothing there now except a single commandment. It ran, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." So Animal Farm is the story of a farm of animals, obviously, that takes over, and the farm is taken away from the humans. So when you hear all the people names, they're actually animals. And the pigs take over, and they govern based on fear, and in the end, they are walking like humans. So that's just a very short snippet. It's not a weird story. It's a good story. It's a very unsettling story. I had to read it in high school, so I know a little bit about it. So goes the stunning conclusion of George Orwell's Animal Farm, a political satire in which the prize boar, Old Major, describes his dream of liberation from the drunken Mr. Jones, that's the human, inspiring the animals to revolt. When the dust settles, the pigs have taught themselves to read and write, take charge, and gradually change the rules to benefit themselves. They lie, manipulate, and exploit the other animals until misery proves the revolution a farce and the new laws meaningless. In the end, the pigs make peace with humans. Too late, the rest of the creatures realize the truth that life after the revolution was better for the pigs, but worse for the rest of them. Section 2, Slavery and Freedom. As the Roman statesman Cicero claimed, legum serve sumus ut liberi esse possimus. Yeah, because I don't know Latin. We are slaves of the law so that we may be free. The Latin word for law Cicero used, legum, is the word from which we get our words legislate and legislature. The study of law revolves around the question, what constitutes orderly and just governance? It is a human paradox that to be free, we must abide by laws that constrain our freedom. Either we must discipline ourselves to submit to an orderly way of life, or we will be forced to submit to tyranny. As Edmund Burke said, society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. A society's measured pursuit of just laws is one of the primary factors that determine its level of thriving. Lawmakers and legal scholars must consider whether the law sufficiently punishes evildoing while at the same time avoids harming the initiative of hard-working law-abiders, liberty and justice for all. America's founders wondered whether such a system was truly possible and whether the people genuinely had the will to sustain it. As Benjamin Franklin emerged from the Constitutional Convention, a bystander, Mrs. Powell asked, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or monarchy?" "A republic," replied Franklin, "if you can keep it." Franklin understood what was at stake. Whether the people were prepared for self-government was far from certain. Closer to our own time, Judge Learned Hand said, "I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. These are false hopes. Believe me, these are false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. While it lies there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it." The message is clear. If there is no love of liberty in the heart, there will be no law of liberty in the land. There is a reason for similar uncertainty today. Harold J. Berman, former professor of law at Harvard Law School, believed law was rooted in religion and transcendent qualities. These foundational beliefs, he said, are giving way to laws geared more to expediency and less to morality. As a result, he concluded the historical soil of the Western legal tradition is being washed away, and the tradition itself is threatened with collapse. What set this collapse in motion? Berman believed the dam broke in the aftermath of World War I. How could the most enlightened, best educated, most scientifically astute nations in the world mow one another down in frightening numbers? Berman was less concerned with who was at fault than with the realization that all of the West's legal structures could not prevent the near destruction of civilization. The question now comes to us. Will we be able to maintain a lawful society amid the challenges of our own time? And there are many. Many people do not believe Christians are capable of doing anything with law except using it to make people miserable. Are they right? Let's seek an answer by digging into a bit of the history and purpose of law. Along the way, we'll examine each of the 6 worldviews we're considering and conclude with an examination of the Christian worldview, which makes what most people will doubtless think is a radical claim. The structure of law derives from God. That's the radical claim, who is simultaneously beyond us, transcendent, and with us, immanent. Because he is beyond us, his character forms the enduring definition of all that is good. Because he is with us, his law applies to all people in all places at all times. Section 3, Overview of Law. What constitutes orderly and just governance? To answer the question, let's look separately at both order and justice. Order. Nothing happens in our communities without laws establishing order. Most of us, if we're thirsty, think nothing of going to the kitchen sink to get a drink of water. For this to happen, predictability and safety must be a function of the law. Water comes into your dwelling courtesy of a water district governing the acquisition, testing, delivery, and proper disposal of water. This includes regulations about which kinds of pipes will be used, how those pipes will be installed, how agreements will be made for laying pipe across private property boundaries, who should fix broken pipes, how taxes are to be collected to pay for this maintenance, how the water is to be acquired in the first place, what price people will be charged for it, how they will pay, and what happens when they do not. All of these are administrative regulations. They are part of our law, but are focused more on order than justice. If a water pipe breaks, people may be irked at the inconvenience. It would be stretching it if they complained of an injustice having been committed against them in the same way if someone had intentionally broken the pipes or was hoarding all the water for himself. One of the earliest sources of administrative regulations is actually recorded in what Jewish people call the Torah, which contains the Mosaic Law. Reading these laws today can be confusing, especially since laws about crime are mixed in with laws about personal hygiene, diet, disease prevention, and even compensation for personal injury. It's important to keep in mind, however, that the idea of a written law was almost unheard of in the world at that time, and these were former slaves who should have had little, if any, idea of how to govern themselves. Much was at stake. In a desert land surrounded by hostile, wicked forces and with no natural sources of food and water, even small mistakes could doom the community. Much of the law God revealed to Moses still forms the basis for law today, especially in the West. Take, for example, Exodus 21:33. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. This law established relationships between neighbors. In reference to a case about a conflict between two neighbors, Lord Atkins said, in the 19th century, the rule that you are to love your neighbor becomes in law you must not injure your neighbor, and the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, receives a restricted reply. You must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbor. Who, then, in law, is my neighbor? The answer seems to be persons who are so closely and directly affected by my act that I ought reasonably to have them in contemplation as being so affected when I am directing my mind to the acts or omissions which are called into question. Okay, that sounds messy, but it basically says, who then in law is my neighbor? Well, when you're thinking of doing something, whatever it is all the people who will be affected by what you are considering doing. That's really what it means. The biblical principles regarding neighbors' obligations to one another became the basis of tort law. This is from the Latin word torcere, meaning twisted out of its natural shape. Tort law governs harms that can come as people live and work together. It includes remedies for things like negligence, which is when a person harms another person through carelessness, when that person was obligated to have been more careful. In securing order, though, it is possible to hurt people in violation of the law. This leads to the second function of law, securing justice. Justice, here we go. In defining justice, Yale University's Nicholas Wolterstorff said, a society is just insofar as its members enjoy the goods to which they have a right. This assumes, of course, that there is a higher law that has been revealed. The founders of America referred to securing liberty, not granting it. The Constitution of the United States is formed around this premise, as is evident in its preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's all the people that come after you. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. By securing liberty, the Constitution assumes that laws are discovered, not developed, found, not created. Most of the founders believed this is so because everyone can observe God's revelation in nature if they have not suppressed their ability to observe it by other commitments. On this basis, it is possible to establish a body of laws to remove barriers to economic arrangements, create a framework for resolving disputes, establish accountability that restrains evil, and provide a better environment in which everyone is allowed to flourish if they choose to do so. Of course, some philosophers have tried to develop a basis for justice apart from referencing God's nature and character. Many law textbooks, for example, go back to the philosophy of utilitarianism, as Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832, articulated it. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, he said. Bentham believed justice could be secured through a felicific calculus, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Wolterstorff strongly disagrees with Bentham. The pursuit of happiness, I can't even say that Greek word, is problematic. Pursuit of happiness is problematic because our ideas of happiness today has little to do with creating space for living virtuously. Trying to make everybody happy would only result in using government coercion or government force to give people what they want. It would be legal, but it might not be right. In order to secure justice, we have to get to the root of the question, what is legal versus what is right? In the 20th century, this came to a head in the Nuremberg trials of the major war criminals after World War II. Were these trials legitimate? After all, Germany had a body of laws and a court system. If the highest law is the law of the state, then everything the Nazis did was legal. Clearly, these monsters needed to be punished, but on what basis? I assume that you are familiar with World War II and Hitler and how he put people in concentration camps, burned them, horrible acts that he did. And he started with the Jews on purpose to wipe the nation out. Not to mention the Nazis went through, once they took over, they went through and the nice way to put it is they euthanized the elderly, but they killed the elderly because they were elderly and they were part of the foundation of families, and usually grandparents, older people, they need more care. Anyway, let's go on. Sorry. If law is based on morality, known by everyone at all times in all cultures, the answer is straightforward. Nazi law was a perversion of clear standards that were obvious to anyone and should thus, by its nature, have been deemed illegal. Secularists, though, cannot rationally take this perspective. From their viewpoint, there's no revealed morality. Because we are evolved as human beings, our morality changes to meet our new circumstances. This question was not resolved. In Nuremberg, the international community proceeded even though the laws the Nazis were accused of breaking did not exist when they were in power. What gave the Allied forces the right to try the Nazis? Because because they assumed power by winning the war. If power is a sufficient basis for law, did the Nazis have the right to do what they wanted as long as they were in power? Would they have been justified to continue their atrocities had they won the war? If not, why not? The fiercest debate on this issue was carried out between two legal scholars, H.L.A. Hart and Lon Fuller. Hart argued for legal positivism, which says that law is what those who have the authority agree to do. So, whoever's in authority, what they say to do is considered law. That's legal positivism. Fuller, on the other hand, took a natural law view. Law should be based on an internal morality that all people possess. In his book on the subject, Fuller, a law professor at Harvard, said just laws are based on 8 rules. These are the rules. The rules must be spelled out so people will know what to do and what not to do. The rules must be publicized so people will know about them. The rules must not be used to judge actions taken before the rules were adopted. The rules must be clear and understandable. The rules must not contradict one another. It must be within the power of the people affected to follow the rules. The rules must not be changed frequently, or the people who are to follow them will be unable to decide what to do. Excuse me. Those in charge of enforcing the rules must actually do so. These common sense principles, constantly referred to in debates about whether certain laws are appropriate, provide the basis for legal standards to this day. Since the time of Fuller, though, the focus has moved to justice as fairness, or using the law to redistribute society's goods in order to compensate for unfair advantages some are said to have received. I read that slow on purpose because I want you to get it. In A Theory of Justice, that's a book, widely considered the most important work of legal philosophy of our time, the late Harvard professor John Rawls proposed a new kind of justice called distributive justice. These principles are the principles of social justice, he wrote. They provide a way of assigning rights and duties in the basic institutions of society, and they define the appropriate distribution of the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. There are obviously many controversies surrounding this view, and we will examine them in a little more detail in the upcoming chapter on politics. As with each discipline we have examined, we'll now look at the radically different views of law that each of the 6 different worldviews hold. Secularism. As we've seen, secularists believe morality to be both constructed by humans and subject to change. If there is no such thing as an objective standard of right and wrong, however, then laws designed to ensure fairness and justice might actually create unfairness and injustice. After all, secularist theology says God does not exist or is irrelevant, and that only matter exists, or materialism. Secularist biology and sociology, on the assumption that only matter exists, assume that everything around us can be explained through natural processes. This is known as naturalism. These 2 assumptions form the secular view of society, according to Julian Huxley. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the world of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. Natural processes, secularists assume, have selected humans as the most advanced species. Secularists trust themselves to create a just legal system because, as Malachi Martin pointed out, we ourselves are the authors of our destiny. Man is exalted. The God-man is repudiated, and with him the idea of man's fallenness is rejected. The key of understanding secularist law is that it must be created to respond to where we think we are in our evolutionary process. This is far different from the Western tradition of common law, which is the basis of law in the United States. In common law, there are few written laws. From the law's perspective, we're not talking about a moral perspective here, but from the law's perspective, it is assumed that an action is legal unless it is specifically prohibited. If a dispute arises, a judge hears the case, examines previous similar cases, and finally makes a ruling. This form of ruling is called stare decisis, which is Latin for it stands decided. The judge then explains his or her ruling in writing. In the Western tradition, legal writings form a body of what is called case law. Lawyers study these cases and compose briefs to persuade judges to see the cases the way they think gives their clients an advantage. Is a certain tax deduction legal? To know the answer, you have to delve into court cases where people challenge the law to see what the judge decided. If the Internal Revenue Service challenges your deduction and you decide to take the case to court, you can assume a judge will look at previous cases to determine your case. Common law assumes that what people did in the past was based on common sense and reason, and that it should set a precedent for what to do now. Attorneys get paid to scan history and pluck out cases they think are relevant and try to persuade judges to see it their way. Juries of citizens are often involved and are trusted to determine whether an injustice has occurred. A verdict of guilty or not guilty is then rendered. Here's the problem from the secularist viewpoint. If you believe humanity is evolving and that people in the past were ignorant and unenlightened, why would you care about precedent? You wouldn't. Newer is better. For example, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as of this writing, a member of the United States Supreme Court, appeared on Egyptian television, she publicly lamented having a rather old constitution. She recommended Egyptians look to newer, better constitutions than the United States Constitution. As you might imagine, Darwin's evolutionary theory profoundly influenced the secularist conception of law. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., famous 20th century Supreme Court justice, said, I see no reason for attributing to man a significance different in kind from that which belongs to a baboon or a grain of sand. Holmes thought our own time demanded something more than common sense or reason. The felt necessities of the time, the prevalent moral and political theories, institutions of public policy, avowed or unconscious, even the prejudices which judges share with their fellow men, have a good deal more to do than the syllogism in determining the rules by which men should be governed. If we are really no different from baboons, in need only of laws that fit the necessities of our time, secularists assume that we'll have a better society when we set aside the archaic laws of the past and explore new legal ground. Political scientist Bradley C.S. Watson describes secularists as follows. Whatever the theoretical roots or disciplinary orientations of the realists, all saw the Constitution as a fundamentally flawed document and decried any efforts to interpret it on its own terms. Statutory law, and even more the Constitution, was seen as an epiphenomenon of deep class biases and social forces unrelated to principles of right or justice. At the same time, it was assumed the best and brightest could extract themselves from the influence of these social phenomena that swept others along like tiny corks on a great river. Given a clear-eyed view of what law really is, along with sympathetic legislatures, the right kinds of sociological arguments, and eventually a less conservative judiciary, they could put themselves in the vanguard of history. Don't get lost in that. It's okay. Obviously, this kind of thinking does not lead to confidence in a natural law that is true for all times in all cultures. Secularist philosopher Delos McCown asks sarcastically, when, one wonders, is in evolutionary history did hominids first acquire natural rights? For Paul Kurtz, most rights have evolved out of the cultural, economic, political, and social structures that have prevailed. This denial of natural rights leads to a denial of natural law. How are these principles, like equity, freedom, to be justified? Asks Kurtz. They are not derived from a divine or natural law, nor do they have any special metaphysical status. They are rules offered to govern how we shall behave. They can be justified only by reference to their results. If laws and rights are not, as the signers of the Declaration of Independence thought, not derived from the laws of nature and nature's God. Where do they come from? The answer is legal positivism, which says the law is not tied to morality. Rather, it is whatever the order of things declares it to be, or whatever is necessary. It also says something else. I'll get to that. Rather, it is whatever the order of things declares it to be. Les Green, professor of philosophy at Oxford University, offers a thorough and clear definition of legal positivism. What laws are in force in that system depends on what social standards its officials recognize as authoritative. For example, legislative enactments, judicial decisions, or social customs. According to positivism, law is a matter of what has been posited, ordered, decided, practiced, tolerated. As we might say in a more modern idiom, positivism is the view that law is a social construction. Legal positivism says that law is what those in power choose to do. To put it plainly, might makes right, or whoever is in charge makes the rules. Morality and law are not related except by coincidence. According to Max Hocutt, human beings may and do make up their own rules. All existing moralities and all existing laws are human artifacts, products of human society and social conventions. So where did we ever get the idea that laws were based in objective standards? To Roscoe Pound, one of the 20th century's most cited legal authorities, governments gave that impression in their efforts to convince the governed that law was a fixed thing. From the time when lawgivers gave over the attempt to maintain the general security by a belief that particular bodies of human law had been divinely dictated or divinely revealed or divinely sanctioned, they've had to wrestle with the problem of proving to mankind that the law was something fixed and settled, whose authority was beyond question, while at the same time enabling it to make constant readjustments and occasional radical changes under the pressure of infinite and variable human desires. As judges make these decisions, the idea of representative democracy gives way to what Robert Bork called Olympianism, the belief that activist judges are an intellectual elite ordained to shape a nation's destiny from the bench. Matter is all there is. We are evolving. God is irrelevant. The founders were naive. The idea is that truth is self-evident, that all are created equal by a creator who gives unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that just power is derived from the consent of the governed, to the secularist, are nothing more than relics of past thinking. And we'll stop there.